Good evening. I'll start with myself. Just want to welcome everybody first and thank you all for coming out. I am Dr. Nate Wright. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. My research focuses on how community development corporations work to revitalize urban neighborhoods. I also have a new project where I'm looking at how community action agencies actually work to create sustainable neighborhoods. So I've been working on this project for the past year. And so also to my left, we have Dr. Vincent Hutchins, who is a professor of American politics at the University of Michigan. Professor Hutchins' general interests include public opinion, elections, voting behavior, and African American politics. He recently published a book at Princeton University Press entitled Public Opinion and Democratic Accountability, How Citizens Learn About Politics. And this focuses on how and under what circumstances citizens monitor their elected representatives' voting behavior. Then we have Kirk McLaughlin. He is chairman of Vista Bank. He is a fourth generation banker. He's chairman of Vista Bank, which was begun in 1912 by W.E. McLaughlin in Rawls, Texas. He's a native of Rawls and joined the bank in 1982 and was named president and CEO in 1989. Under his leadership, the bank has grown from 15 million total assets in one office to 340 million in 13 offices around the South Plains and in Dallas and Fort Worth area. He also was partner in Caprock Insurance Agency in Rawls for 20 years. And he finished his second term as director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas in 2000 and was chairman of its audit committee. And he also is a former director and served as a member of the Community Bankers Council of the Texas Bankers Association. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our theme for this evening is race and community relations in urban America, a problem of ethics. And what we're going to do is we'll have each speaker, starting with Dr. Hutchins, kind of give a brief overview of how their area of specialization kind of relates to our theme. And then we have a couple of questions that I will ask each panel member, and then hopefully we'll have some time for a couple of questions from the audience.
And they've done a lot of very fascinating work on this concept known as dehumanization. So very briefly, what that refers to is this notion that, as the name might suggest, there is in contemporary 21st century America this pervasive sense that African Americans somehow are lacking in the qualities that make one human. And it is because of this pervasive belief, to some degree, this belief exists in an implicit, beneath the level of conscious awareness of many people, including potentially some members of the police force. This sense that African Americans are somehow less than human, as crude and disturbing and jarring as that phrase may be, that sense is still present in this country, and it contributes to some of the things we've seen unfolding in the headlines over the last several months. So I think that there's much to be said about the sweep of racial attitudes, the extent to which negative stereotypes remain in our society. But I just wanted to put on the table for hopefully our discussion this evening the notion that it isn't simply the pervasiveness and persistence of negative stereotypes, but it is the pervasiveness and persistence of this notion that African Americans are somehow less than human.
All right, Kirk, would you mind giving us an overview of banking as it relates to this subject?
Sure. The concept of dehumanization is something that I've grown up with. It's gotten better, but I think the popularity of Donald Trump, how he attracts attention, and why it is that people, what he has to say resonates with people, is maybe an example of the broader context of the kinds of things that are being said. And I don't know that it's confined to the African American population. I think there's a general dehumanization, anybody who's different than me, on any context in America today, and that's a part of the polarization of thought across the political landscape. And life in general, whether it be based on religion or politics or race or ethnicity, culture. We just seem to be losing tolerance for each other's differences. And my work has been to try to raise up. In a small town, everybody's your customer, and so when you're in business, you want everyone to do well. In banking, if everyone succeeds economically, then the bank succeeds economically. So my bent has always been towards working towards everyone's economic success, and the disadvantages that the Hispanic ethnic group particularly has had, I've always found to be interesting.
I was asked to just touch on education and how it relates to our theme. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of my personal research and how that kind of brings in education as well. So currently I look at how nonprofits, specifically community-based nonprofits, work to revitalize urban neighborhoods, specifically how they work to create educational opportunities for low-income individuals, how they bring jobs and such, and how they just improve overall economic conditions in urban neighborhoods. And what I found is that since the war on poverty in the 1960s, low-income neighborhoods have struggled to keep up with their white counterparts in terms of resources, whether it be related to education, schools, whether it be related to just jobs overall. And unfortunately, there's been a disinvestment in urban neighborhoods. Even looking from an educational standpoint, we know that there's a huge disparity. And being that the United States is probably the #1 country in terms of how they spend on education, but yet we have so many inequities in our school system. And the challenging part for a lot of low-income individuals is that they're not getting quality education. As a result, they're not able to compete for quality jobs as such. And something that we also don't talk about too is really just values. It was a research report I read earlier this week that talked about expectations of African-American parents compared to the expectations of white parents. And essentially, there's this expectation in African-American communities that we don't expect our children to go on beyond high school, whereas in Caucasian communities, it's very different. And they have this expectation that you will go and you will get a higher degree, and you'll be a banker, or you'll be an educator, or engineer, or lawyer, or doctor. And unfortunately, this mentality has had a negative impact, especially in African-American communities. And essentially what I study is how nonprofits can kind of go into these communities to develop programs, because at this point now, government has really failed in addressing these issues related to ethics and even social equity as a whole. So even though all this money has been pumped into it, no change has been made. And so community-based nonprofits have been really successful in addressing these inequalities at a grassroots level. And so many of us talk about looking at government, but government has really failed, in my opinion, Black America in addressing a lot of these issues. Looking at the Flint water crisis, again, that was left in the hands of government to address that. And so, again, my lens is really how organizations or institutions outside of the public sector can actually work in revitalizing urban neighborhoods. If we look at the South Bronx in New York City, it was not until residents banded together to work together to actually turn those neighborhoods around. And so even with education, it really needs to be more of a grassroots initiative in terms of how we approach that. So that's kind of what I bring to, I guess, this panel this evening. But I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask Vince and Kirk. And the first question I have for Vince is, does your research indicate more or less advancement opportunities for people of color due to absence of political clout?
Okay. So I'm trying to process that question and therefore come up with a coherent answer. So give me a moment. Could you say again the question?
Does your research indicate more or less advancement opportunities for people of color due to the absence of political clout?
So I take Nate's question in part to be that in light of the lack of political influence that the many minority communities in general possess, are they able, nevertheless, in spite of that lack of political influence, to generate opportunities to advance? Is that a fair characterization? Okay. I think that is true. So again, I study attitudes about politics and attitudes about race, but I also teach more broadly about questions of race, ethnicity, indeed class. So I have a little bit of knowledge about this, but my research doesn't always directly focus on this. But the short answer to the question is that communities of color and communities writ large, I think Kirk talked about this as well, obviously try to do their best with what circumstances they're presented with. So it is true that there are more disadvantages on average that communities of color face relative to white communities. But there's also been some, success stories that we've seen over time. There's been success stories in the education arena. There's been success stories in the business community. There's been success stories in a number of different areas that represent indications where Black and Latino and other communities of color have succeeded in spite of the odds. And of course, we're all familiar with individuals who have managed to make a name for themselves in a variety of settings in spite of the obstacles they've had to face. So, so the short answer is certainly yes, individuals are able to overcome. But I think the broader issue, the broader question for myself at least, is why these communities and these individuals have to overcome these barriers in the first place. I think the issue is not to expect heroic efforts to overcome these obstacles on the part of particular individuals who may be indeed heroic, but to find ways in which to diminish those obstacles so that individuals need not express or display this kind of heroism in order to accomplish the sorts of things we all want to accomplish in life. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to recognize what those barriers are and to do what we can as a society to try to diminish them so that opportunities for success are not reliant on the heroic efforts of exceptional individuals.
That's an excellent response. I actually wanted to kind of piggyback off the event. I actually had an article that I just wrote that actually found a significance between political clout and actually the effectiveness of community-based nonprofits and actually revitalizing urban neighborhoods. And essentially, they need political clout in order to succeed in turning around the economic conditions in their neighborhoods. And I say that is because what happens is usually what community-based nonprofits do is they encourage their constituents to be part of the political process, and in turn they become advocates on behalf of the organization. And so when it comes time for advocating for more resources for the community, these individuals who have been trained or been encouraged to be community organizers or to be active participants of the local politics in the community, they become really strong advocates, key advocates, more to say, in their neighborhood. So they're the ones who are at city council meetings when it comes time for allocating resources. And actually, because of that, they have a greater impact in the community because they then become players at the table. And so I would just say that you need political clout is essential, especially on the community development side, because you need people who are going to advocate on your behalf. And as we know, nonprofits are very limited because of IRS regulations, but because they have people who can then speak for them, in turn, they're able to garner resources on behalf of the organization. Next question is for Kirk. And is poverty a challenge for money management?
Why don't you ask a narrow?
Well, on a household level, obviously. So. I think the biggest obstacle, in my mind, to get groups, wholesale groups, ethnic groups, whatever, out of poverty is to consider what is poverty, how are we defining poverty. If we're going to measure it by the dollar in the system, then we have to ask these people to